If you've ever wished your raised beds were crawling with healthy earthworms instead of dry, lifeless soil, this is one of those moments where a small change makes a massive difference. Before we get into it, make sure you subscribe to Evergreen Garden, drop a comment telling me what you grow in your raised beds, and share this with another gardener who's tired of fighting dead soil. What I'm about to explain is simple, cheap, and shockingly effective when done right. Sprinkle this once, and worms don't just appear by chance. They come because you've given them exactly what they need to stay, feed, and multiply. Why earthworms matter more than fertilizer ever will. Serious gardeners understand that worms are not decoration, they are living soil engineers. Every worm moving through your raised bed creates microscopic tunnels that improve drainage, oxygen flow, and root penetration. Their castings contain plant-available nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and trace minerals in a form roots can absorb immediately. Unlike synthetic fertilizer, worm activity improves soil structure permanently. If your raised bed lacks worms, it doesn't matter how much compost or fertilizer you add. The soil will never reach its full potential. The simple ingredient that triggers a worm-feeding frenzy. The ingredient that consistently draws worms into raised beds is plain cornmeal. Not instant cornmeal, not seasoned cornmeal, and not corn flour. You want basic, finely ground yellow cornmeal with no additives. Worms cannot eat raw, organic matter directly. They feed on microorganisms. Cornmeal breaks down quickly, feeding bacteria and fungi that worms absolutely thrive on. When you apply it correctly, you are not attracting worms with food alone. You are creating a microbial buffet that keeps them coming back. Why cornmeal works better than scraps or manure. Kitchen scraps rot unevenly and often attract pests before worms arrive. Manure can be too hot and actually repel worms if not aged properly. Cornmeal is different because it is dry, stable, and predictable. Once it gets moisture, it begins breaking down evenly across the soil surface. This creates consistent microbial growth without overheating the bed. Worms sense this activity from below and migrate upward into the bed because the environment becomes safe, moist, and food-rich. Right, so let's talk about how to apply cornmeal the right way for raised beds. For a standard raised bed, say 4 feet by 8 feet, you'll want to use just 1 cup of cornmeal for the entire surface. Sprinkle it evenly across the soil, keeping the layer thin and nicely spread out, rather than dumping it in piles. You see, heavy piles can easily go anaerobic and create those sour conditions that worms really dislike. After you've sprinkled it, lightly water the bed so the cornmeal settles into just the top ½ inch of soil. You're not trying to bury it deeply. Worms, after all, feed near the surface where microbial activity is at its strongest. Timing, honestly, matters more than most gardeners realize. Apply cornmeal when soil temperatures are consistently above 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Worms are pretty sluggish in cold soil and, well, they just won't respond well no matter what you add. Early morning or evening applications work best, since moisture tends to stick around longer at the surface. If your raised bed tends to dry out quickly, try applying cornmeal right before a gentle watering cycle or a bit of rain. Moisture activates the microbes, and it's really the microbes that draw worms upward. So, what actually happens in the first week after application? Within about 3 to 5 days, bacterial populations absolutely explode in the topsoil. By day 7, you'll notice worms begin migrating upward and concentrating near the treated areas. If you gently scrape back mulch or soil after a week, you'll often spot worms clustered just below the surface. Now, this is usually the point where many gardeners get a bit excited and, well, over-apply. Do not do that. One application is enough to shift the biological balance. Overfeeding can cause microbial crashes that reduce oxygen and actually harm worms instead of helping them. So, how often should you really use cornmeal without upsetting the balance of your soil? Well, during active growing seasons, it's best to apply cornmeal once every 4 to 6 weeks at most. But if your beds already have heavy mulch and plenty of compost, then, honestly, once per season may be enough. You see, worm populations tend to regulate themselves. If there's plenty of food and the conditions are just right, they'll reproduce naturally. But if you keep piling on food, you can actually disrupt that balance. So think of cornmeal more as a signal to wake the soil, not as a constant feeding program. Combining cornmeal with mulch is, honestly, one of the best ways to ensure long-term worm success. Cornmeal works best when it's tucked right under organic mulch. Things like straw, shredded leaves, wood chips, or even aged compost. They all help retain moisture and protect that vital microbial life. After you've applied your cornmeal and given it a good watering, go ahead and add a thin mulch layer if the bed is bare. This simple step prevents the surface from drying out and actually extends microbial activity for weeks on end. Raised beds without mulch dry out quickly, and dry soil drives worms deeper, out of reach, where your plants just can't benefit from their activity. Let's talk about some common mistakes that prevent worms from showing up in your raised beds. Applying cornmeal to dry, compacted soil without watering is, honestly, one of the biggest mistakes you can make. Another is using treated or bleached corn products that contain preservatives. Definitely avoid those. Excessive tilling after application also disrupts worm migration and destroys those precious microbial zones. And finally, synthetic fertilizers and pesticides can pretty much negate everything you're trying to accomplish. Worms will avoid chemically stressed soil no matter how much food you provide. Now, here's why this method creates long-term soil improvement. When worms colonize your raised bed, they don't just feed and leave. They reproduce, build permanent tunnel systems, and distribute nutrients deeper into the soil profile. Over time, your raised bed becomes darker, looser, and so much more resilient to drought and compaction. Plants root deeper, require less feeding, and show much stronger disease resistance. This isn't a quick trick, it's a real biological reset. If you found this valuable, do consider subscribing to Evergreen Garden for real practical gardening knowledge that actually works. Share this with another gardener who's struggling with dead raised bed soil, and drop a comment telling me if you've tried attracting worms before and what results you've seen. Your soil really can be alive again, and once you see worms flooding your beds, you'll honestly never garden the same way again.